Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Maureen Ryan. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And this is the Long 2020 series. We are here today with another installment. And we're so pleased to have with us Nirmala Erevelles, Bernard Perley, and Tom Rademacher. So I'll get to bios for each of our guests in just a moment. I have some programmatic things to say about how the event will go. You may be watching on YouTube. You may be in our Zoom webinar. Either way, welcome. In the Zoom webinar, your cameras are automatically off. And if you'd like to ask a question or raise a comment, you're more than welcome to do so at any time. You can leave the question or comment in the Q&A. I know there's a couple of different options. So there's chat and raise hand, but let's use the Q&A so that everything is in one place. And each speaker is going to give about a 12-15 minute presentation. And then we will get to moderated discussion after that. So if you are moved to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A whenever, and we'll get to it when the time comes in our event. So I should also say we're very pleased to have a guest moderator today. Douglas Haynes is a fellow at the Center for 21st Century Studies this year, and it's been really wonderful to be in conversation with him. He's an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And maybe you want to say a little bit about your work, Douglas, but he works on environmental justice issues. He's writing a book right now on, well, actually, Douglas, why don't you tell us what the book is about? I don't want to get it wrong. Do you mind? You're muted.
I'll just be super brief. I'm working on a book about education in the Anthropocene and new visions for education in the Anthropocene that address crises of equity, wellness, and eco-anxiety. So I'm curious to think about those broad issues in an intersection with everybody talking today, and to help field questions.
Thank you. See, I wasn't going to do as good a job as that, so I appreciate it. And now I'll turn to introducing each of our speakers just briefly, and then I will turn it over to our first speaker. We're going to go in alphabetical order by last name. So our first speaker is Nirmala Erevelles. She is a professor of social and cultural studies and education at the University of Alabama. Her teaching and research interests lie in the areas of disability studies, critical race theory, transnational feminism, sociology of education, and postcolonial studies. Specifically, her research focuses on the unruly, messy, unpredictable, and taboo body, a habitual outcast in educational and social contexts. She is the author of Disability and Difference in Global Contexts Toward a Transformative Body Politic. Bernard Perley is director of the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia. And we're also very honored and sad. He's a former UW-M faculty member as well. So we're happy to have him back. He's an activist, advocate, Indigenous anthropologist whose language research and advocacy continue to be expressed through publications and professional conferences, as well as community-based projects such as collaborative art installation pieces, keynote presentations, and language revitalization workshops. He is the author of Defying Maliseet Language Death, Emergent Vitalities of Language, Culture, and Identity in Eastern Canada. And Tom Rademacher is a full-time teacher teaching 8th grade language arts at an arts and racial integration magnet school near Minneapolis. In 2014, he was named Minnesota's Teacher of the Year. In addition to teaching, he speaks and writes about anti-racist education and supporting newer educators. He is the author of It Won't Be Easy, an exceedingly honest and slightly unprofessional love letter to teaching. So welcome to all of you. I'm so thrilled to have you here, and I'm excited for our conversation. So I will turn it over first to Nirmala.
Hi, I'm Nirmala Erevelles, and I first wanted to thank Maureen for organizing this and giving us this opportunity to present. And of course, I'm excited to have a conversation with my two fellow presenters. I'm also, and also I wanted to thank the participants for joining here on a Friday evening. So I really appreciate that. I was going to, this is a paper I'm actually writing some of it in a new form right now. And so I'm just going to construct a context within which my arguments are located. And I'm going to end with some of the questions that I want us to think about, because the topic I'm talking about, the title of it is Cripping the Long 2020 as if Disability Matters, where I'm going to center disability in the context of the pandemic. Okay, so, and I'm going to read just because I can stay within time. We did not know then, as we watched as the mirrored ball slowly descended in New York's Times Square, that after 2 months of normal life, we would be haunted by an isolating silence and dread of the long 2020 stretching its barren promises ahead of us. For those of us for whom the notion of the normal was the reassurance that our privileged lives would continue uninterrupted as we made complicated plans for our consumptive desires in a global paradise seemingly created solely for our pleasure, when the proverbial shoe dropped and the World Health Organization confirmed that we were indeed in a global pandemic, we panicked. For those of us accustomed to weathering global crises, bolstered by the comforting realization that we are almost always safely ensconced from most global tragedies because of our self-described exceptionalism, there was disbelief that this was real. An overreaction, perhaps, too far away from us, for sure. We have the medical infrastructure better than any other nation in the world, of course. We were never afraid before, so why now? But then, scarcely before our lips could repeat these boastful reassurances, to quell the gnawing fears slowly eroding our habitual arrogance, people like us began to die. And they were not just the huddled masses in far-off lands or elderly residents in segregated nursing home facilities, or mostly folks with chronic illnesses and comorbidities who were never meant to survive anyways. Instead, they were our neighbors, our friends, our celebrities, our heroes, for whom even our most sophisticated respirators and powerful drugs could not ease their desperate attempts to take a breath. And as our morgues filled up so that we had to stack bodies in makeshift freezer trucks, and fatigued doctors and nurses and public service employees pleaded with the nation for basic safety equipment, and with our cafes, schools, theaters, and businesses shuttered, our airplanes grounded, our streets haunting in their stillness, we now fought for toilet paper and scarce food supplies and shook our heads in fearful despair, muttering, "What's going on? What's going on?" A year later, it is this yearning for the normal that we once enjoyed that bears critical reflection. This normal that thrives on embracing a social that has little tolerance for the vulnerabilities that reconfigure time, space, and embodiment. This normal that urges us on our relentless quest to surge ahead and consume the products of transnational capitalism, no matter its often violent and exploitative commitment to profits rather than people. This normal that has historically always sorted out the anointed from all that represents matter out of place, and renders the latter as disposable collateral that is essential for fueling the engines of progress. This normal that has historically always counted on precarity as the necessary byproduct of reimagining techno-fantastical futures. This normal whose very existence has required the abnormal, the deviant, and the disabled to buttress its own centrality in the everyday, while simultaneously ensuring the forcible segregation of others from life's daily rhythms in an effort to preserve a fictional reality of an untroubled, predictable future. For some of us, suddenly woke to this startling truth-telling that disrupted our routine worship of the normal, this pandemic felt like a eureka moment where the harsh inequalities of everyday life and its attending discomforts demanded from us an earnest call to action that nevertheless struggle to materialize. For so many others, however, this novel recognition of everyday adversity has never been novel at all. In fact, they are everyday realities of isolation, scarcity, economic desperation, diminished life possibilities, and disposability predated this pandemic. The only difference being that the vicissitudes of their daily existence now mirrored in life experiences of those who prior to this pandemic had barely given thought to forging a desperate solidarity with those whose lives seemed radically different from their own. But even though the opportunity for building radical coalitions to challenge the hegemony of the normal and disrupt its dehumanizing violence could have metamorphosed into tangible transformative possibility, instead, there is now a numbing recognition, if at all, that we might have squandered this opportunity in our relentless yearning for the familiar, the routine, the habitual, the normal, and in doing so, inadvertently or not, reproducing the very degradations that might destroy us all. My earnest provocation in this presentation is to paint with broad strokes a portrait of the pandemic as a long moment of transformative possibility, with the wherewithal to discompose the ableist, heteronormative, white supremacist, and exploitative conventions of normativity in an effort to reimagine what Alison Kafer has described as crip futurity. Kafer writes, and I quote, "I am particularly interested in uncovering the ways the disabled body is put to use in these future visions, attending to both metaphorical and corporeal presence and absence. Rather than assume that a good future naturally and obviously depends on the eradication of disability, we must recognize this perspective as colored by histories of ableism and disability oppression, and I might add, imperialist and settler colonialist oppressions as well. I cite Kafer here because the particular terror that we have faced during this pandemic is the terror of the proliferation of disabled body minds, seemingly one of the most dreaded outcomes of this pandemic. In fact, we are all privy to much lamenting at the prospects of COVID brain fogs, debilitating physiological impairments, chronic pain, depressive mental states, and other mental disabilities, all conditions that render body minds so vulnerable and debilitated that they can no longer function at their presumably former efficient and profitable capacities. In fact, these ableist constructions of disability as debilitating difference are touted widely as the single most pressing incentive to urge the privileged to mask up, maintain social distancing, and get vaccinated. Not so much in efforts to ensure our collective survival, because that would be too socialist, but rather to rally behind the imperative to halt the proliferation of disability in a techno-fantastical future that abhors vulnerabilities within a neoliberal, exploitative, and accumulative economy that has little patience for the inefficiencies that its associated debilities portend. I want to point out here that there is nuance to this argument. I want to be very clear that I'm not urging that we abandon safety measures during this pandemic. In fact, my family and I have been most diligent in following these mandates, even while living in one of the red states where the community values individual freedom over collective solidarity. Rather, my argument here, echoing Kafer's thought-provoking challenge, is to urge us to explore how the labor of disability is put to use in even liberal and seemingly progressive rhetoric as the rallying cry for the reinstatement of the normal that focuses predominantly on the annihilation of disability, rather than organizing around the care work, and here I'm citing Leah Lakshmi Pepiznia Samarasina's work, which is essential to our collective survival. I call this labor that disability is called to do exploitative and cannibalistic, because the hypervisibility of disability simultaneously becomes the rallying cry for foregrounding the appalling flaws in public health initiatives directed towards multiply marginalized communities, while at the same time demanding that these same initiatives enact the swift and efficient annihilation of disability from community life. As such, disability as a social and political category of difference becomes the centripetal force about which the global response to the pandemic revolves, and by doing so becomes the victim of its own deployment. This sort of lethal contradiction becomes apparent when paying attention to both the discursive and material fields of intelligibility that have emerged out of this pandemic. When ventilators were in short supply, medical personnel resurrected formulas that even in pre-pandemic times were utilized to determine the quality of life of multiply marginalized people living at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. A eugenic calculation to determine who should live and who should die. The scandal within the Cuomo administration, where COVID-19 patients were sent back to nursing homes to convalesce, and where the number of deaths went unreported and undercounted in spaces rife with chronic understaffing, obsolete medical technology, and dire neglect, was representative of treatment typically directed towards multiply marginalized communities conceived of as disposable citizens. We have come to accept the inevitability that in moments of scarcity, whether it be ventilators, priority designation for receiving vaccines, as well as basic access to healthy food, medical care, affordable housing, disabled people living in multiply marginalized communities are quite literally at the back of the proverbial bus. Additionally, we have failed to connect the previously enforced isolation, both geographic and psychic, of both disabled and non-disabled people from these communities to carceral spaces like special education classrooms, alternative schools, boarding schools, immigration detention centers, group homes, nursing homes, and the prison industrial complex, as well as the current exacerbation of psychic pain and trauma that comes with neglect, abuse, and the recognition of one's disposability both within and without the pandemic. It is interesting to note that this persistent experience of disposability is also of pandemic proportions, a recognition that typically is rendered invisible and one that we have been unwilling to eradicate. So let's do some definitions here. An epidemic is the rapid spread of an infectious disease to a large number of people in a context where the disease is not normally prevalent. Endemic refers to disease that is chronically prevalent in a specific context and region and is sometimes assumed to be native or natural to the region. And the pandemic raises the stakes because its infectious diseased effects have now spread through human populations across a large region, for instance, multiple continents or even worldwide. So as in the current context, as we face the daily, and then I'm just shifting context here, as we face the daily murder of Black and Brown and Indigenous citizens by the state, often I want us to pay attention to the fact that their deaths are blamed on their natural pathologies within their bodies, on issues as obesity, as asthma, as mental illness, as opposed to the violence of the state that has actually or actively pursued their annihilation. In this paper, I will also be talking, which is why there can be an interesting connection in our discussion about the Flint water crisis and, of course, COVID-19, but I'm not going to do it now. I'm now going to end with a set of questions that come up. So are the daily murders of brown, Black, disabled bodies a recent epidemic, or are such murders endemic to US society? given its brutal history of settler colonialism, slavery, imperialism, and transnational capitalism? What are the implications of reading these murders through these kinds of radically different lenses? How does the deployment of a medical model to address an epidemic of violence shape the way we read the social? Where does the locus of the pathological lie? In the bodies of the fallen citizens or in the police who serve the militarized state? Will our efforts at transformation appear inadequate, given that the roots of endemic violence arise from a violent pathology that is assumed to be natural to US society? Also, what kind of interventions does a medical model inspire when violence is viewed as a disease that needs to be urgently eradicated? And will that foreclose alternative interventions that could foreground an ethics of caring for others within the creation of communities that Alison Kafer has called Cripping relations, like CRIPKIN, in our simultaneously well-connected and yes, hopelessly divided world? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. And just to get the conversation started on the long 2020, what I'm going to do is turn my camera off. And so that's a photograph of me back in last January. And so you can see that the effect of the long 2020 is actually embodied and it's visible. So I think this is where every one of us have experienced this 2020, the past 2020, as something that is worthy of, first of all, grappling with the kind of uncertainties, but also the kinds of narratives that we're telling today is going to be important in how we do remember 2020. One of the things that I wanted to do is first thank the organizers, Maureen and Richard, for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And I also want to thank and say hello to my colleagues and friends at UWM. I spent many wonderful years there, and the Center for 21st Century Studies has always been a really welcome home. And I'm delighted to return for this conversation. I also want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And they call this area Musqueam, but the settler colonial society calls it Vancouver. And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight is the Indigenous perspective on this long 2020. And so we can bracket the year from January 1st to December 31st and say that, oh, that was 2020. But we all know that it's more complicated than that, and that 2020 had a long antecedent process. And Nirmala actually highlighted that particular aspect of this kind of long history leading up to what we were experiencing last year in 2020, but it's also following us into 2021. When we flip the calendar, 2020 did not stop. And so this is where the kind of benchmarking of the kind of calendar is an easy way of being able to kind of shut things off and say that, okay, that was last year. Well, what about this year? And the kind of anticipation of what is normal, again, as Nirmala had pointed out, is something that we should be deeply afraid of. And so we can't go back to normal. And so there is an underlying history and long development of particular kind of violent pathologies that we have to address. We need to recognize that there has a long history, and it didn't just happen in 2020. And it's following us into 2021, as we see in the news every single day. And so for me, I agree with Nirmala, where she identifies that these aspects of normal is something that we have to be cautious of. And so who gets to define what is normal and how we return to that? And so if normal means that we have to go back to the way things were before 2020, I'm sorry, we're still, moving ourselves towards a point of crisis. We've been going that direction for a long time, and the COVID pathogen has just increased or amplified the kind of system failures that that have been happening for some time. So one of the things that I wanted to do was think back about, well, how do we talk about 2020, and how do we recognize it as a long 2020? For me, what I wanted to do is weave together different narratives, and for the sake of, let's say, simplifying the argument, I'm not ignoring the complexities that go into this conversation. Rather, what I'm trying to do is create a more recognizable, set of narratives. And so I have three narratives in mind in particular. And as I think about how I want to recall and record this particular moment, I recognize this as an aspect of what I call narrative entanglements of the long 2020. What does that really mean? And so what I'm suggesting here is that for the sake of visualization and thinking about how these narratives get entangled, just as Nirmala had pointed out, there is this kind of rhetoric of the privileged that say, oh, I can't wait to get back to normal. Whereas others, brown bodies and black bodies, have to recognize that, oh, it's just going to be the same. So normal has two very different values. And as a Native person, I also recognize that there is yet another set of normal narratives that are called into mind. And so today I wanted to kind of highlight some of the ways I'm thinking about this from the perspective of Western intellectual tradition. And so for me, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the way we think about texts. And and just to show off one of the texts, After Extinction, edited by Richard Grusin, when we open this book, one of the things that I see is a one-dimensional narrative where you have to turn page after page after page. And so there's this kind of encapsulation of a singularity in terms of the narrative, that all the pages are stacked on one another, and you have to just kind of turn the pages one by one. But I'm thinking that this is the Western mode, that kind of linear progression from one page to the next. And so it allows for a particular kind of reading and a particular kind of narrative strategy. And so that narrative strategy allows the past to be relegated to something that's immaterial, and that the present is something that you appreciate at the moment. And then as you think about the end of the article, the end of the book, that you can anticipate something in the future. And as Nirmala had pointed out, we have to be cautious about how we think about the past and how we think about the present, because it has every implication for how we imagine and even conduct ourselves in the future. So this one-dimensional thinking in terms of the text allows a particular kind of reading, but it's also giving us a particular kind of constraint in that kind of linear temporality. The second narrative strategy I'm thinking about is akin to thinking about art. And so when you look at a painting or a photograph or a mural or any other art object, you take the whole thing in at the same time. And so it doesn't have the same linear process that you immediately get an impression, that first impulse, so that you can begin to understand what that particular narrative is going to be about. And then your eye begins to, build the narrative, and it's up to your own perception that allows that narrative to take place. But all along, as you do this, you still have the entire context in mind. And so for me, one of the things that I think about as these kinds of paintings or even art installation pieces would be the kind of, two-dimensional narrative. It's not that one-dimensional narrative where the pages are stacked one by one, you get that linear narrative, as much as you think about the entire picture. So you see the big picture, and then you can pick out the narratives. And the narratives don't have to follow any particular sequence. But usually the artist gives you cues on how that particular narrative should unfold in terms of the composition. And the third narrative I want to talk about is going back to what I describe as Native American or Indigenous origin stories. And those kind of creation stories are often, thought about as, these things coming from the past, that somehow they're children's stories and they're immaterial to today. But for me, working in the field of Native American oral traditions, I recognize that these stories are not about the past, they're very much about the present, and it has great implications for the future. But one of the things that I also want to engage in terms of Native American storytelling is that, three-dimensional aspect. And so for me, it's not just about telling a story or reading it in text or looking at it on a big sheet of paper, as much as to recognize that as you tell the story, you create that particular Indigenous world. For me, it's important to recognize that the stories are not just a bunch of words that trigger particular ideas. The stories are actually creating worlds. And so for me, this idea of that kind of emergent vitality becomes important. And so a textual reading, like a book, is going to allow you that kind of sequence from page to page to page. And so at the end of the story, you can say, well, that was a great story. But for me, what's important about a lot of Indigenous oral cosmogonical stories is that it's about world creation. Okay, now the reason why I bring these three narratives together is because one of the things that I recognize is when we think about how this past 2020 unfolded, I wanted to think about it in terms of these three strands of narrative strategies. And so for the textual representation, one of the things I wanted to do was think about how there's a preoccupation among philosophers today in thinking of object-oriented ontologies. And so what the heck does that mean? And so Timothy Morton in Hyperobjects was making this argument that what we need to do is think larger than the objects that we're actually imagining as these kind of material aspects. We need to think larger in terms of something like climate change as a hyperobject. It's bigger than we can actually grasp. And so for me, as I think about COVID, it's also one of those hyperobjects. And so it's an object-oriented approach. So I'm drawing on his inspiration or his idea of trying to decenter the human in order to be able to understand what these hyperobjects imply and how they communicate and interact with us. COVID is a similar way. COVID is this kind of hyper object. How do we decenter ourselves as victims of the COVID virus? How do we think about the COVID virus as having agency in itself? And so I'm drafting a story, a narrative about how the virus itself imagines the world. And so part of the initial sketches of the representation would be something like this. And so as I develop the story, the virus is interacting with the world, seeing it, and we're seeing it through the virus's eyes. And so at the same time, I'm able to kind of look at how humans responded to this virus. And so for me, the kind of looking at it from this object-oriented ontology, this new Western philosophies, was really important. But embedded in that also is my sense of being able to recall this idea of, well, the long 2020. So this virus is not just, this kind of momentary event. This is a long string of events that goes back to what Nirmala was saying about the kinds of deep roots of this kind of, how did she put it, violent pathologies. And so this is where I draw on Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor. And so for me, one of the things that we have to recognize is that, sometimes violence, as we see day after day after day, these are the kind of tragic moments, immediate sort of, let's say, grief that we all have to grapple with. But as Morton was saying, not Morton, but Nixon was saying, that what we're looking at also, and we have to pay attention to, is the slow violence of colonialism, of racism. And so this is an ableism and sexism. And so we need to recognize that this is always working in the background. And so for me, pulling these ideas together brings me back to Richard's edited volume on After Extinction, in which I, and my fellow authors, Darrell Baldwin and Margaret Newton, wrote this chapter on surviving the sixth extinction. The whole point of the argument was to, look at, does the word extinction, is that translatable in our respective languages? And we discovered it wasn't. And so we made the argument that extinction is an invasive concept, and it perpetuated that slow violence. And so for me, as we think about how we make this narrative of the long 2020, we need to weave back into that this kind of recurring slow violence. If we don't do that, then what we're going to do is suffer the same slow violence. It's going to come back on all of us, not just people of color. It's going to come back on all of us. And so the final narrative about the Native American origin stories is a narrative of hope. How do we create these worlds? And so for me, it's that idea of the Native American stories always being able to rebuild the world, make it anew. We recognize that, the past had particular kinds of important moments that we have to address, but we also recognize that how we tell that story is going to make a difference on whether we go back to the old normal. I'm sorry, that's going to lead to even more hurt and harm. Or are we going to imagine something that's different? Are we going to imagine a new world where, the narratives that we can share come together? And so for me, my project is to be able to say that if you want to understand how we can survive the sixth extinction, we can survive these pandemics, all we have to do is listen to the stories that Native peoples are telling as they survive 500 years of colonization. We have the skill sets and the tools to deal with the kinds of changes that we're all going to be grappling with. And the 2020, well, we like to think that that was going to be a moment, but as Nirmala had pointed out, it doesn't seem that's going to happen. Everybody wants to go back to before 2020. I'm sorry, it's not going to work. We have to think differently. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Let's turn to our final speaker, Tom Rademacher.
Thank you. Wow, my brain is already very full and I have so many good notes already of things to think about. And so thank you, Nirmala and Bernard. I think so much of what you both brought as far as the perspective of the pain we've lived through, but also a hope that perhaps it means that there's something new coming. That's a lot, I think, about what I will speak to as well. I am in the midst of traveling. I'm with family right now, so I'm in actually my nephew's bedroom, so I won't be able to hold up very cool looking books. I do have some Lego and a dinosaur, that's what I can offer as far as props today, I guess. But that's actually pretty close to what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about basically the answer to the age-old question of how are the kids? I teach 8th grade, so I have 135, 140 8th grade students that I teach every year. And so, I had a group last spring and then a group all this year that I've been teaching kind of through this pandemic. And, I think the most useful thing I can offer is kind of what that looks like, what it looks like to be with and around young people going through this moment. And I think one way to do that, although we're talking about 2020, is to talk about really the last week. So we started, right? It's been a week, I'll say that. And I feel like the number of times in the last year that I've started a class with my 8th graders by saying, wow, you guys are living through an incredible and unprecedented time, and you guys are going through so much. And I feel like just since maybe a year ago, those events just keep picking up and picking up. So last week, Thursday, I'll start there. It was for me a really big day. Last week, Thursday was one of the few times I've been lucky. It's only been a few, but they've been awful every time. I've gone to a funeral for a former student. So a student who was 23 that died very unexpectedly. And missing the community of getting to really truly be with the people that were there, because we all had to be so far away and so kind of abbreviated. And then I went back to school, and school had started to feel we had just gotten back in person. So maybe 2 weeks ago is when all of my students were finally back with us. And I got to actually see them in the classroom, and it all felt a little normal. And so I was kind of coming in last Friday, feeling that normalcy, feeling how good that was going to be. And then as I was starting my very first hour, the principal and the nurse and our dean all walk in the room, which is always, of course, not a good sign. And it turns out that there was a positive case identified in that room, and all of those kids needed to quarantine and then get sent home that day. So we had this our first quarantine, our first positives since coming back. And it just kind of shook everyone in the grade, right? All the other cohorts, all the other pods of kids all know that their friends have just gone home. Everyone's starting to worry about who's got it, who doesn't. And actually the fear and the anxiety of that moment felt so much like spring break last year. There was this new thing, this new danger happening with this pandemic, and all of a sudden, and we didn't know kind of who had it, who could get it, how dangerous it would be. And now with the new strands that are out there, we suddenly have a very similar feeling again, where we don't exactly understand how quickly it's spreading, but it feels really, really awful. So that was kind of how our week ended on Friday, was this this fear of disease. Sunday at 2 p.m. is when Daunte Wright was killed in a city 12 minutes away from my school, which in the community that I'm in is actually our police department that we share a parking lot with is the police department that killed Philando Castile. So the community has been full of this of this pain and this stress and this conflict of many students of color who are grieving and angry and terrified about this, and also part of a community that the 3 houses that face our school all have really big back the blue or something like that yard signs out front, right? So this community that's giving a message of support for these actions, and so many students that are dealing with the fallout from those actions. In addition, of course, right? So Daunte Wright was 13 minutes away. His car, after he was shot, and his car hit another car, it actually hit the car of the grandparents of one of our teachers. And the number of connections we have in a community that I have a few kids who, you know, their sister played on a basketball team with his sister. They knew him from another activity. Like, it feels really connected. It feels really close to home. As of course did Philando Castile. And as of course, 1 year ago, just 12 minutes really the other direction, when George Floyd was killed. And that was 3 blocks from my house. I recognize almost all the people in the video, including a few of those officers as people that are around my neighborhood all the time. So the closeness of a lot of these global issues that are happening is like our students can't escape it, right? It's something they're just sort of they're just swimming in all the time. And so Dante Wright happens at 2:00 p.m. I have students emailing me by Sunday night. Monday morning, I would like to spend some time truly reflecting and sitting with kids and talking about this. But Monday was also the first day of state testing, and also the first day of Ramadan. So it was right? If you want to kind of know what teaching is like right now, I think that's a good moment to think about Monday morning of all those things at once. And as we were sitting down to start our state testing, we get note of another student in another classroom that has tested positive for COVID. And that whole classroom now, parents need to get called and all those kids need to get sent home where they will be for the next 2 weeks. So we have another quarantine hit. Now we've got only a little more than half the grade is actually in the school anymore and everyone else is home. And in the midst of all that, right, we get through testing, we get to spend some time talking to each other, trying to do what we can to reflect and give space for just to be with each other about Dante Wright. And, you know, that was a week. That was a small, short week of time, right? And I think when we tell the story of this year, of this last year, it's going to be really easy to focus on the amount of trauma that we've seen. And there's nothing that in me that wants to say we should ignore any of that trauma, right? It's been an incredibly traumatic year, and especially for young people, it's been an incredibly traumatic year. When I was in 8th grade, the absolute most important thing, the biggest worry in my life was the death of Kurt Cobain, which had happened 2 years before, but it was still the most important thing to me and the thing that I still worried about all the time. And the level between that and what our kids are dealing with now, and the compounding and the concentrated effect of the amount of trauma they've seen in the last year, at a time when everything feels permanent anyway, right? I don't know your 8th grade stories, right? But the kid you thought you loved in 8th grade, you thought you'd love them forever. And the things you worried about, you thought you'd worry about forever. The band you loved, you thought would be the best band in the world forever. Everything starts to feel permanent around that time, as you've just become aware kind of the world outside of you. And for students right now, they're becoming aware of a world where there is not a significant societal structure that has not shown its failings in the last year, whether it is policing or health or education or the economy or politics or democracy, all of these things have shown this shaky structure that actually holds them up. And that's what our kids are looking at. So it's been a really scary year, and a scary year that in the middle of all that, there is this feeling or this worry that students are losing a year, that it's a lost year for students, that it is, that we talk a lot about learning loss. And I think the most important thing I want to point out is that our students have certainly not lost learning this year. In fact, they've gained far, far more than we could have expected of them. I have my own child as well as 10, and the amount of, I mean, they've been asked to work almost as a college student this year. The amount of self-direction, the amount of organization, the amount of motivation they've needed to show is something that we have never asked of a 5th grader before. And we've never asked of 8th graders before. And yet they've really shown that. So often in my life, when the world has been at its worst, I have taken strength from the young people that I get to be around. And this year has been absolutely no exception to that. I'll tell a short story of one of my kids. I don't want to take up too much more time, but there was a student who we were worried about this learning loss idea. We were worried about this kid, 6th grade, straight A's, 7th grade, straight A's, really great student. And all of a sudden we just weren't seeing work from them. They weren't showing up to band practice, which it was their favorite thing. And everyone was suddenly worried of like, wow, this kid has just dropped off the face of the planet, isn't learning this year. And I call home and I call the mom. The mom is worried about the grades as well. And the mom starts telling me, I know he hasn't done any of his reading work, which ultimately really it's the kind of stuff we've always confused for school, but is not truly like the things that show learning, right? It's, did you check off this box? Did you write up this like reading log or any of that stuff, right? He hasn't done his reading work. And she says, well, he's reading, 4 books a week, probably. He's reading all the time. He's just not filling out this stuff. Okay, well, I'll talk to the teacher. We'll give him credit. It's going to be fine. He's reading far more than I am. That's great. How about band? He hasn't been showing up. He's got these flute lessons. He hasn't been showing up to flute lessons. Yeah, he hasn't really been practicing his flute that often. He did teach himself to play piano this year. And so he's been practicing piano for an hour or 2 a day. Right, in the midst of this, all this stuff happening, this student has, like many students do when people get out of their way, picked the learning they wanted to do and dove into it head first, right? That's not the same with all students, right? There are students that, for whom this year has been the fact that they are here with us, the fact that they have survived this year, the fact they've persisted at whatever level they have, is an amazing thing and has given them a piece of independence and of resilience that we've been trying to get kids to have and show forever. They've stepped up and showed us they've had it. We just weren't asking for it in the right ways. Now that they're coming back to school, they're demanding, much like the message of Bernard and Nirmala, they don't want to go back to the way we were, right? Students that spent the last year getting to do work when they wanted to, being at home, getting to kind of do the work that was the most interesting to them, they don't want to go and sit for an hour in a seat and be quiet while a teacher talks and do the worksheet and then move on to the next class, right? They want things to be better than they were. They're actually demanding things that be better than they were. And that power of it, I think, is really a beautiful thing and a beautiful power that they're showing. So I think that's the biggest message I want to give everyone kind of before we move on, is that this is not a lost year. I really reject the idea of learning loss. So I hope if you hear that, you can push against that. The generation of kids that we have is demanding that we are ready to deserve them, and we will have our work cut out trying to get out of their way with all that they've learned this year. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. This has been incredible. I'm so honored to have heard from all of you. And there's a lot to talk about, I have no doubt. So I will turn it over to Douglas Haynes to kick us off.
Thanks, Maureen. That was so exciting. And what I've been trying to do is just think about synergies between these 3 presentations and questions that they bring up. And I'm sure everybody else has their questions too. It's such a privilege to be in such an exciting combination of approaches. and people coming from different fields and experiences. And those are the kind of conversations that I find especially fruitful. So this has been really rich and wonderful. And let's talk. So I've come up with a few different synergies so far between people's presentations, and they've led me to one set of questions that maybe is a good place to start. And I'm curious what synergies you all observed as well. And so feel free to throw those out, of course. So first of all, everybody had in common really that we're at this inflection point that we need to reflect now. And Bernard brought up Timothy Morton earlier, and he has this idea of ecological thought and the importance of ecological thought. In other words, that ecological thought can be a form of action, that reflection is devalued in the society, and all of you both embodied that kind of reflection that needs to happen now and speculated about how it could take different forms. So I thought that was interesting. The need for a care-based society versus the society that we're living in that devalues care and institutions and processes of care seem to keep coming up. And of course, narratives and their power to define what's normal and shape our realities and imagine possibilities kept coming up as well. So I wanted to build on that and see if I could kind of combine some of that in a question for starters. That is about how we imagine these three-dimensional counter narratives. And Bernard, of course, started off or ended thinking about how Indigenous creation stories in particular are good places to start, and that Indigenous traditions offer us lots of skills and values and metaphors and ways to think about imagining a three-dimensional counter narrative or counter narratives to the ones that are pushing us back towards this destructive normal. So I wanted to ask really, what all do you think are the characteristics of the narratives that we need now to create this new world? What are the metaphors needed? What values should be at center? We could get more concrete than that even, like what are the skill sets and tools? And what do these look like embodied in different kinds of institutions, like education or in other institutions of care? How do we take this idea of counter narrative and then break it down into more specific, more concrete values, skills, metaphors? What does it look like? Anyone want to start? Yeah.
Okay, I'll go.
Great, thank you, Nirmala.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did not talk about it right now because of the time limits, but I think that within what I was talking about as an imagining of Crip futures and an understanding of this idea of Crip kin relations, which become these positions, which are actually not just narratives, they're actually lived experiences that the disability community, particularly, which again, I hadn't had a time to cite, like the work of disability activists, not so much as scholars, but disability activists who are working within the context of this notion of disability justice and are very much living at the intersections of all these differences, have articulated ways of thinking about care, survival as an interdependent possibilities, as opposed to the way we've been historically thought of as thinking about, of actually working through this kind of independence. And one of the people that I would suggest, like, because people were suggesting books, one of the books that I had kind of like briefly, I just mentioned the author, Leah Lakshmi Pipsina Samarasina. I mean, I hope I haven't mangled their name. Book Care Work is a fantastic example of how disabled people, literally at the intersections of all differences, have even, this was, the book came out prior to the pandemic, but even during the pandemic, disability communities have produced alternatives to the kind of care that they could not get from the dominant spaces, and also re-articulate, I mean, disability, actually it's mostly within whether, like I like the way Bernard was talking about, we have to pay attention to the alternative, to the narratives that get produced outside of the margins, that are not published in books, but are also very much embodied in the ways in which people present their body minds to the world and to each other. And so the counter narratives are there in the narrative, in the storytelling, in the practices that exist in what I'm calling the care work that is being discussed. But the fact is that we are so caught up in the normative narratives that we are failing to pay attention, nor are we willing to actually spend a lot of time supporting those spaces where those kinds of counter practices and counter narratives abound. So.
Yeah, I think those are really, really great points. And I think that one of the things that I appreciate about Tom's presentation were those kinds of counter narratives, saying that, look, it's not just about a narrative of loss, but it's also a narrative of discovery, as these youngsters are finally given an opportunity to explore the questions and the kind of talents that they want to develop. And I think that's a kind of creative sort of world making that's going to really provide not just a counter narrative, but also options for imagining possible futures. And I think that for me, that's what, as director of the Institute here, I really want to hear what my students are saying, because they're the ones that are going to be able to create, the kinds of discourses and the kinds of practices that's going to allow them to configure the world. Maybe it's going to be a more just world than we've built, with our own narratives. And I'm really excited to see what they're going to come up with, because again, it's about that kind of creative energy, the kind of, let's say, the term I use is emergent vitality. And, if we can just continue to build that as a strength in the youngsters, I think we might have a fighting chance.
My only quick add, I think, is that I agree with all of that, and I think the young people will be I think Nirmala said creative world building, right? Like that's the work that young people do naturally and brilliantly. I think there's conversation in my world in like K-12 education of like, how could we possibly go back to normal? How could we not change? But the power structures haven't changed. And so that the fleeing back to normal and the fleeing to like make sure that those power structures haven't been shaken in this year is really disconcerting and really disappointing. And so I think part of the stories that we need to tell need to be stories of, abolition of those structures, while we talk about the worlds that will be created in their absence.
I think just to follow up on that, Tom, could you talk a little bit more about what structures you feel like need to be abolished, and also your idea that the students, when you said at the end there that students want something better, they are already asking for it. What kinds of practices in and out of the classroom are they asking for?
This will be really popular with this crowd, but higher ed is, when you look at like, anytime we try to change schools, right? Higher ed is a very small piece of it, but it's a piece, right? Like, we have to it's approval through higher ed. They need to be there supporting it. Unions need to be there. Local, state, and national politics need to be there. There's just, and none of that has changed, right? The way that schools get funded or the laws that govern us have not changed in the last year, right? And so those structures and those powers, and those are the formal ones. And then also, like white supremacy, like is the structure on which our schools are built. And honestly, like, again, just from a K-12 perspective, a lot of schools and a lot of districts that seem to be positioning themselves to work to decenter and deconstruct whiteness in their schools have shown that they were willing to put that work to the side over the course of the last year. So that work like stalled in a lot of places in a way that's really, again, disappointing. As far as what the students really want, right? I mean, what students have ever wanted is they want school to matter, and they want to be able to do things that feel relevant to not just their lives, but to their futures. And they want to feel, I mean, in the world that we are in now, there's nothing that's going to stop a 13-year-old from being able to put their message and their words and their stories out into the world, right? It's no longer preparing them for this imaginary real world that they are a part of. They are already impacting that world. And so, and yet, right, then they go to school and it's like, okay, but sit in this desk and do this worksheet. And it feels so divorced to the work that they think that they're going to do. So I think that's a primary one. And then again, like it's those white structures of school and the structures in school that greatly benefit and comfort white students. And it's systems that kids are looking at. I mean, there's going to be a walkout at my school on Monday against systemic racism in education. Like students are more than aware that they are part of a system that does not have their best interests in mind. And they are not in a place where they are willing to let that go. Thank God, right? So, you know, it's that work and it's that shift that's being demanded of us from young people right now. And it's kind of going to be up to the adults to figure out how we can help them create what they want.
Thank you for that. I think that is a good time just to, I should add Sheila Fayshaw commenting in the chat. This speaks to what everybody's been saying, especially to what you were just saying, Tom. We need to be willing to listen to children and ask them about their experience this year. My college students are talking about topics that I had a hard time dragging them to in the past. I can't wait to open a space for them as future teachers to talk about their experience as learners this year. So, you know, in a sense, she's kind of saying, and then all of you are saying, we should let them drive the ship more in a sense, and they're going to tell us what these future narratives need to consist of. It sounds like.
I also wanted to add to what y'all was saying was that particularly when you were asking the question about structures, because I also think that one of the benefits, which is one of the arguments I'm making, is that the pandemic also has the space for this kind of transformative narrative. And one of the things, particularly in K-12, but also in higher ed, is that the pandemic has forced the schools and higher education institutions to be more accessible in terms of its flexibility to different kinds of bodies and needs. And the most tragic thing is that both K-12 and higher ed, the administration, they're pushed to going back to normal and to eradicate, in fact, all the options of access that were available for different body minds is so painful and problematic. It has also, you know, gotten, because at least I have a 16-year-old who's a junior in high school. For this year and last year, they abolished all high school exams and they were asked to do projects, which was so freeing, because the very logic of schooling and college is very ableist. You know, the construction of what is like what is considered appropriate knowledge, the kind of testing that's done, that's reproduced. And so again, the pandemic cleared the way, you know, for all of this, and there was such rejoicing because kids were producing those, you know, just as Tom was saying, these kinds of like creative counter narratives against this thing. They were also able to use their time flexibly in ways that they could choose, because they were not caught in those, basically the prison that is always for many of them is school. And unfortunately, again, this notion of getting back is in so many ways erasing precisely those options that were offered. Now, there were also other problems to it. For some children who were already isolated, of course, it accentuated more of the isolation. And instead of producing, and we should be spending a lot more time, not so much as medicalizing, the kinds of what they're calling mental health issues and trauma-informed things, instead of medicalizing it, we've not, I'm trying to urge at least the principal in my daughter's school to rethink the ways in which we could now build caring communities in school. But our response again to any kind of trauma is to react through a medicalized, that pathologization and fixing of individuals, as opposed to stepping back and looking at the ways in which the ways in which trauma is constituted within the conditions that occur, the ways through the history. And so both Bernard and Tom were referring to them also in different ways, like the social, like I can't imagine what it must be for children in Minnesota, in the state of Minnesota, to having to deal on a daily basis, with this kind of the kind of like mass murder by the state and its citizens, right? So the fact that instead of engaging that, we respond these very medical ways to these kind of like, quasi, and many of those medical ways are also modes of surveillance, rather than modes of enabling students to express themselves, engage with their own trauma, and then be able to talk about it and express themselves and be transformative. So.
It seems to me, I'm glad you brought up the notion of time, Nirmala, because it seems to me that medicalizing of trauma or trying to treat it in a medicalized way also has to do with that kind of impatience, right? And that we don't want to, looking at context, creating communities of care takes a much longer or different view and notion of time and how change happens, right? I wanted to throw it out there to folks, if it's interesting to folks, to think about time narrative and the long 2020, like how have notions of time in the context of education or otherwise been altered, and what do we learn from them, from that alteration?
I think that one of the things that's happening here in Canada is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this follows up on the recognition, well, the apology by the government for the residential school system that inflicted trauma on generations of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and recognizing that this has been a long trauma. It's that slow violence, and Nirmala, you pointed out that, well, what we need to do is be careful of how we describe this form of trauma. And so one of the things that I recognize is that even though the Canadian government wants to say, okay, we apologize, that was wrong, we really feel bad about it, and we want to help you heal. And so what they do is immediately create this narrative of victimization that these Indigenous people are all victims of this process. And so what we'll do is we'll allow you to share your trauma with us as this kind of healing moment. And so when I look at this, then it goes back to Douglas, what you're suggesting is that there's that kind of expedience. And so, and Nirmala, you also use that kind of a similar expression, that there's an expedience to addressing the problematic of, I think the dealing with, the phrase you used was disposable citizens. And so let's hear their story and then just kind of move them away. And Tom, you were mentioning that, okay, it needs to be more integrated and critical than that. And so for me, one of the arguments I'm bringing forward here in Canada is that if, we want true healing here in Canada about the residential school trauma, then what we need to do is recognize that in a dyad where there is abuse, there is the abuser and the abused. And it's not just the abused that need healing, it's also the abuser. And so this is where, again, if we can identify and then provide that counter narrative that the structures that are in place also need healing. If they can get that message, then we can actually move forward with a project where, it's both the abuser and the abused that are going to find healing. If it's just the power structure that, the abuser says, oh yeah, we'll help you heal, there's not going to be any healing. And I think this is, again, what, Douglas, you're pointing to. It's an expedient solution. And so it retains the power structures, and it doesn't really relieve the harm. It doesn't relieve the kind of violence that's being done to these populations.
And I just I was glad you asked about time, because again, I was going to cite, actually, she's at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Ellen Samuels, an English department, who has this fantastic essay on crip time, which is really an argument where disabled body minds, but also, people of color, indigenous communities, we've all had different relationships to time that are actually very effective in disrupting the efficiency that capitalism requires us to do. And for those of us who are in a very practical terms or very concrete terms, I know, at least in higher ed right now, I just got an email today from telling, I'm tenured, but telling non-tenured professors that they have more time to do their work. But there's also assumption about the fact about how crip time enables us to see then that what we produce doesn't have to necessarily be on time, that there are ways to configure time. There's a way to configure space. There's ways to configure relationships. And that we need to, that in some ways disability, especially at those intersectional spaces, becomes a really powerful, it actually becomes the frustration, which is what I was trying to say in those narratives, which is also that whole pandemic thing. If we can cure all these side effects, it's not really to give people better qualities of life. It's so that we can better harness them to be more efficient workers. And we are hating the pandemic because it's disallowing the efficiency that we've been dreaming of. You'll have all been reading about the slow professor, right? And I like the slow violence. I mean, we can deal with the slow violence by actually engaging with a different kind of slowness that pushes back against it. And so.
Richard and Maureen, would you like to enter the conversation? Or I'm inviting you to enter the conversation, I guess.
Go ahead, Maureen.
I don't have much to add, honestly. I mean, I've been really struck by the resonances among each of your, within and among the topics you're covering. And I'm just really struck by the clarity of what you're talking about and how nice it is to be thinking about these issues. I mean, this is just a minor comment, Tom, but I was really stunned by two things you said. One, that every major institution has failed, and those failures have been on display for children coming of age right now. And that is that was stunning to hear. And you're absolutely right. The other thing that you said was that standardized testing is still going on, which seems utterly bananas. And I wonder, I mean, this is not a question. I'm just telling you, I'm just sharing with you my feelings. That to me seems evidence of the reconcentration of power, that standardized testing has never been about children and their success. It's always been about, I mean, these companies have a lot of power and they don't want people to be like, you know what, we don't actually need this. I have to assume. I don't know. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Exactly, your thoughts are mine. Yeah, there was a point, when we started, we had 10 weeks left in school when kids rejoined. 5 of those weeks have some standardized tests in them. And that's just, it's absurd. And it's all the worries we had of oh my God, these kids are missing out, and think about their mental health. being at home, we need to bring them back to school, and then we need to put them in front of a computer to answer multiple choice questions for 3 hours is as absurd as it sounds. Yeah.
In my daughter's school, they actually closed down the rest of the school so that they could socially distance the kids that they were bringing from outside to take the damn tests. And it's like, and it's so, because I mean, we're also, I mean, for all the resiliency that we are also thinking around our students, our children are being through a lot of trauma in themselves. And like and as Tom, you just rightly pointed out, there is no reading, like we say we care, and yet the determination, so they cancel exams, but not standardized tests. Almost as if that measure wasn't there, we would, like all schooling would go to hell. Like I was like, pay attention to what children's needs are, and that would be what you would consider something that was successful. But no, yeah. Sorry, I had to vent on that one.
Yeah,
And I also, go ahead, Richard.
yeah, I just wanted to jump in and first thank all three of you for great papers and really provocative. And on the school question, I really appreciated your message, Tom, about students actually learning more, because when I think about my own schooling, especially near the end of high school, which is right around 1970, 71, I almost stopped going to classes, because I did for a while, because I was reading so much literature on education and things like that, and about how destructive standard education was. I just said, well, screw this. But I mean, some of our best learning were things like amnesty days and other kinds of things that were going on that were happening outside the class. So that was a really useful. I mean, I don't have kids right now in school, and so I'm sort of out of touch with that. I just also wanted to say something about Bernard and Nirmala's papers, and maybe bring something together, because I've been thinking about how in the pandemic and was wondering about this, whether people with pre-existing conditions and people who have autoimmune problems or suppressed immune system, how they've also, or have they, I guess it's a question, I'm not sure what the answer is, have they also been included in the disabled as something to be gotten rid of or extinguished, or is it more a sense, or is there a different sense of the relationship between this population that is limited because of things like immune system? And I guess I would connect that with what Bernie was saying in his last comment about healing and healing the system. And I guess I just, for the two of you, was interested in that way about what's the difference between a model of healing that singles out a population as being less than able or other than able, and the kind of treatment of disability. So do those come together, or do they depart in some significant ways?
I guess, okay. I mean, actually, I mean, I think I was trying to allude in the paper, and I think I will be alluding it a lot more. Like, it's not the issue of healing can be understood in a really broad way. And I think I would talk about that even in different cultural traditions, non-Western cultural traditions, that healing is much broader than the very kind of scientific way in which we talk about it. And it was something I was going to be building on when I was doing the definitions of pandemic, epidemic, and endemic, is the fact that the way we've conceived of healing here is within the Western medical model is the issue of pathology, where there is a vector and we have to destroy the vector. And it depends on where we locate the vector. So in a lot of these other things, we locate the vectors solely in individuals. And when they're non-curable, the individual then becomes the very embodiment of the vector that needs to be destroyed. And so those were the questions. I think I kind of put it there abruptly, but when I'm going to talk about like the Flint, where I want to talk about the Flint crisis briefly, I want to talk about, the struggle for Black Lives Matter and the kind of daily violence, and also within the pandemic and where bodies are. It's that what would be the shift in the analysis if we thought of the real pathologies or the pathogens as existing within the frameworks of the state, right? The police violence, within the ways in which, the Flint, it's not so much even the rivers, the ways the state has handled what's happened in Flint, Michigan, so that the pathologies are not within the individual, like what we're talking about, the way we talk about cure in the medical model and the way we talk about healing. Healing is more a socially contextualized response. Cure is very both, there's almost a kind of like this murderous thing. So there's also this notion of how when we talk about cancer, we talk about it as the war on cancer. But we know that cancer also is not it's not just it is sometimes people live with cancer. It's not an issue of a thing. So it's also our narratives, the kinds of it. In some ways, it's the narratives, the discourses, but also the practices and the ways we frame that then makes it so that disability then becomes really, in a kind of ableist context, the thing we need to, which is what I'm making the argument, we need to get rid of. And actually, In-Jung Kim talks about it really well, as she calls it necro-activism. I'm going to be putting it in my paper. I didn't have space to talk about it because she's like, it's a really kind of like, we kind of like celebrate, for us, our mode of activism is about getting rid of disability. And that's what she calls necro-activism. And so moving away from that to healing, which is a very different kind of ways in which, like, whether it's truth, it can be a psychic healing, like truth and reconciliation, to very much to the ways in which communities also find ways to support each other and heal, as opposed to these kind of clinical one-to-one individualistic measures. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that, this conversation is one of those forms of healing. And I think that the counter narratives, the kind of, interrogation of metaphors is one of those aspects of, coming together to, share these counter narratives and think through the kinds of potential for addressing the kind of system failures that Tom was pointing out. And if we can call attention to it and we can begin to actually imagine the system as being a pathogen, then is it just about finding a cure? Or is it something that requires a totally different orientation? And I think this is where Nirmala has pointed out that it's about the relations. And I think that's absolutely essential. Because when you think about the institutions, no institute or institution does this or that. It's the people in those institutions. And so if we think about the relationships, then we have a chance of actually communicating with those others that may have a different perspective. And I think that it goes back to the idea of these counter narratives. But also how these narratives create, first of all, awareness, but then the second thing would be the potential for change. And I think it's that finding that common ground where both can, whether it's the abuser and the abused, or the clinician and the patient, how do we, instead of having a power structure narrating the patient's hurt, what if it was a different understanding and there was a relationship rather than this kind of abstract sort of, let's say, formalization rather than a personalization of the kinds of harm that's being done?
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. We're actually a bit over time. I have a YouTube comment I wanted to bring in from Lane Hall, who is our English faculty member at UW. And Lane says, to all three speakers, this has been great. To Bernie, we really miss you. Hearing you today makes me remember why. Nirmala and Tom, I found your words to be deeply moving. Thank you all. I thought that was a nice note to end on. I want to thank everybody for being here. This has been truly terrific. And thank you so much to Douglas Haynes, our guest moderator. You did a beautiful job, as we knew you would.
Thank you for inviting me, and I was really moved by this as well, so it's great to be included.
Thanks. We will be back on the 23rd, which I believe is next Friday, with a panel with some architects. Beatrice Colomina, David Gisson, and Daniel Barber will be with us.
And another guest moderator.
And another guest moderator. Thank you. Jennifer Johung is an art history professor at UWM. She will be guest moderating. So we thank you again for being with us, and we will see you next week. Take care, everybody.